Ooh, okay, it's official. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Susan Watts, the owner of Olson-Larsen Galleries in West Des Moines, and this is Elise Vernon, the gallery manager. And we are here today to talk with Olivia Valentine and Shannon Stratton. So without further ado, Elise will introduce our two guests.
All right. So Olivia Valentine, we just started working with her this year. She's a new represented artist for us. She's a visual artist working in textile construction, drawing, and photography, as well as collaborative projects that span a variety of media and disciplines. Recent exhibitions include the Des Moines Art Center, the Museum of Design in New York, the Danish Royal Academy in Copenhagen. And she is the recent recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship for Installation Art in Turkey and was also awarded a 2020 Iowa Artist Fellowship. She's currently an assistant professor of art and visual culture at Iowa State University. And our other guest is Shannon Stratton. She's an artist, writer, and curator with a background in fiber arts and painting. She was founder and executive director of Three Walls Chicago from 2003 to 2015, and chief curator at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York from 2015 to 2019. Currently, she is executive director of Oxbow School of Art in Michigan, and we are so excited to be speaking with you two today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, there we go. Are we going to be pinned side by side in the view, do you think?
Let's see.
Although I think Olivia is going to share her screen first for a little bit.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be invited to talk to Olivia. Thank you so much for the invitation. I guess I will introduce our format though, just so everybody else knows what we're thinking. Olivia is going to talk a little bit about some of her earlier work that informed a lot of how I wrote about her practice for the museum, for her exhibition. And then we're going to have a comfortable conversation with each other about her practice and kind of get into ideas and influences. So she's got that slide up there. Olivia, I'm going to let you take it away.
No, excellent, Shannon. And I don't know, I'm really excited that we could make this work out. Thank you to both Susan and Elise for making this happen. I feel like Elise and I had a conversation about maybe doing something like this, what feels like years ago. It was just a couple months ago. And so I'm glad we were able to find some time and a place. Part of me was thinking today, though I'm inside, that this would be a lovely little garden party that we should have today.
Sure.
So, yeah, I think, Shannon, it was really delightful to be able to have you write about my work this year, this spring. The essay was also ultimately really helpful for me to think about my own practice and where it might go in the future and how it's happening. And so I put together a whole pile of slides. So we have lots to look at today if we'd like to, but hopefully we will also keep it conversational in nature, because I feel like I've talked quite a bit in a very structured format. So I'm looking forward to making things more open and in dialogue. But you brought in a couple of pieces into the essay that I have included here, as well as a couple of others that are maybe more recent or related. And so one that you talked about was this piece, Guest Room at the Drake, which was a commission I did for a private home back in, I think I first started it maybe in the early 2011 or maybe even 2010. It did ultimately take, I feel like most of these projects take 2 or more years start to finish for me, depending on the circumstances of my situation. But here, a piece, an image of the final piece, actually taken from not across the street, but across the alley in Chicago. The title here is Guest Room at the Drake. This piece is a piece of handmade bobbin lace. It's really large scale. For me, one thing that's always been really interesting and important is to think about architecture and drawing and representing it at the scale that it exists. And so I feel like this is not the first time I was able to do that, but certainly one of the times that I was most excited to be able to do that. And then ultimately also thinking about point of view, which is something for me came from photography ultimately, and how, which is a big part of my background. And so here, this image looking from a guest room actually at the Drake Hotel into this apartment, and to be able to see this little glimpse and glimmer of the piece was, I think, an important moment of documentation. I think about the show that I just finished at the Art Center also, that had so many different points of view that were represented and I was engaged with, that was, it's nice to be able to see that drawn through my work. Shannon, I think you wrote about it really nicely here also, in that it wasn't necessarily clear where one was, whether one was from outside looking in or inside looking out. And that was very much what I'd been thinking about, maybe not putting those words exactly, about thinking about bringing this threshold space of the window inside an apartment, bringing it from the sort of edge of the building into the inhabited space there. And so a couple more images of that. This is Tara Hills, actually, Chicago artist and textile conservator who especially when I was in Chicago, I worked with to figure out how to put all the ends together. But here she is working in my studio in Chicago at the time, helping me get this piece ready for installation. So it was 2 panels, and also to give a good sense of scale here, that here installed in the studio, where one panel is mostly complete, dissolving a little bit in that lower left-hand corner. And then the other window, the second window, was actually in the process, either, for me, it was either of falling apart, getting deconstructed, or ultimately also finishing that construction process. Here with the tools of its making actually being the material of the windowsill itself. And then installed into the home that it's in, it actually wrapped the corner. So thinking of something also that, for me, relating drawing and lace making has been, I would say that the drawing actually came first, and then the lace making became a way to make those drawings physical. And so here, then thinking further about making that 2-dimensional or almost 2-dimensional drawing really start to become more spatial in nature, just kind of wrapping the corner, but also simply, for me, this was an act of orthographic projection where the windows were just projected directly inside and they fell where they may. And so that corner wrap made a lot of sense to me with that. And so some details here. And then this is a second, maybe more recent lace window. It's a little bit more delicate in nature. This is a 3-piece project. This one's actually made in linen as opposed to cotton, which is what I usually work in. This may be the first and last time that I do a piece entirely made out of linen. It's really difficult to work with. It needs to get ironed all the time, and is ultimately a little bit just more difficult, but I wanted to try it here, really simple. The title, The Entering Takes Away, was from some poetry. Emily Dickinson, the last stanza of a poem from her. And I started this piece in maybe I think it was 2013. So it did take 3 years, start to finish. This one happened to travel with me. I think I worked on it in maybe 4 or 5 different places, kind of doing the final stitches on it, being back in the Midwest, both in Wisconsin and then in Iowa before I showed it for the first time in summer of 2016. And so here, one of the things sort of structurally textile that I was interested in is taking these 2 really simple lace grounds and then having them sort of mesh together in what was essentially a double weave, where the 2 panes of a window might overlap with each other. And then otherwise also letting gravity take its course, having it yawn a little bit, open up. And it's installed quite simply. It's just rigid metal at the top and bottom, and then everything else is drape. So those are a couple of lace making pieces. Shannon, from there, I'm moving into actually some of the stuff from Turkey. I don't know if you'd like me to continue or.
Maybe just do that a little bit, and then let's break and chat for a bit, and then we can go to the show.
So this, because these are all maybe roughly from 2010 to 2015 at the end of the day. So in Turkey, where I had a Fulbright to be in 2013, 2012 and 13, oh boy, the years are getting a little fuzzy on me. I was looking there at the headscarf lace edge called Oya, which is a knotted needle lace. And again, I was interested in making relationships between the landscape and the architecture, scalar relationships, and also interpersonal relationships to the body, to inside and outside. In Turkish culture in particular, I found that there was some really strong differences between inside and outside, but also that there were all sorts of things that demarcated these boundaries. Oya that was worn around the face, especially in the Ottoman Empire, was one of those, but there was also the space, the balcony, where people would sit and spend time, not being totally in their house, not being totally outside, depending on the circumstances, whether urban or rural, the dynamics might change there. But the first project that I did with Oya was to bring Oya to the scale of the city. So here you can see an installation that happened both outside here in the alley, besides outside the gallery, and then also inside. I don't have sort of all of the research images here, but in the next image, we can see an example of Oya that's at scale. Here, I translated Oya into a drawing and then translated that drawing into a hand-cut piece of tarp. But in Turkey, it would actually be called balcony tarp. So have this relationship to this architectural not ornamentation, but space of in-betweenness, shall we say, or space between the interior and exterior, this edge. And so here I took that Oya that's normally very small and blew it up to something that was maybe, I don't know, half a meter or so high, in blowing up the scale and structure of the Oya, but also thinking about the city. So here, some of the motifs that you see are mountains. I was thinking, while the show was in Istanbul, I was thinking about the city of Izmir doing this, and I made it in my studio in the city of Izmir. And so these are apartment blocks hanging down, draping across the city yet again. The second part of my time there, I was out in a rural region, Cappadocia, very, very different environment. Here I was learning to make Oya with some of the women in the village. I was also walking a lot here in what I called the Valley of Women, where there was clearly what may have been a convent, or at least a women's church in some of these soft and malleable mountains. So here I was thinking about the lace edge and how I might relate that to the landscape ultimately. While I'd originally thought about doing installations yet again, ultimately the work became performative. I think it's actually, for me, a really nice thread to think about performance in my work and my own body. It certainly actually was going on long before this, but this was the first time I maybe made a really direct relationship between textiles I was learning to make or thinking about, and then actually putting my body in the landscape. And so here, mimicking some of the structures of Oya on these staged and documented walks, where I was looking at the edge of the mountain. And so those happened, these happened over about maybe 2 months, but always in the morning. The walks would happen once. I'd document them, and then it took me ultimately several years to put them all together afterwards. And it's hard for me to look at this image in particular, Kırmızı Manzara, which translates to red landscape, without thinking about some of the events that were going on in Turkey almost simultaneous, I should say, with my time out there, which were the Gezi Park protests of 2013. This event here was what had triggered it ultimately, which was a protest in Gezi Park. Here you see a college student getting blasted by tear gas by the police for protesting essentially there were a lot of different things going on with that, but it had a lot to do with public space versus private space, how it was occupied. It's interesting to think about, for me to think about these protests now. I remember several years after the protests, I had a Turkish student, and she said to me about the protests, this would have been maybe 2015. She said, Olivia, that was such a hopeful time, right? There was a lot of hope actually that things could change and people could be changing things. Here, there were students occupying the park because they were protesting a military museum that was going to get built in that park at that time. It was in the wake of what had been a really difficult set of May Day protests that year. So starting with May 1st, this was the end of the month, May 28th, so just about now. Istanbul had been flooded with tear gas the whole month, basically. And so here you had a bunch of young people in Occupy style protests trying to hold on to the parkland. And this evolved into a full summer of protests all across the country. Here later in some of the spaces adjacent to Gezi Park. And then there was also this artist, Erdem Gündüz, who had been staging these, what he called standing man protests, where people were trying to figure out where the boundaries of gathering and being an individual body in space, where that was, if there was a boundary. He said, if I stand here in space, can you arrest me for this? And so these evolved into a series of protests. And so I did actually some of the photographs that I was very much out in a rural location, far away from a lot of these protests, but thinking about my own body as a foreigner in Turkey, I couldn't help but respond to some of these with those images. So I don't know if that's I feel like that's both loaded. It also feels historical by now with everything that's happened in so many different places since then. But it's, yeah, it always seems really relevant to me when thinking about those images in particular. I do have a couple more recent photographic images that on one level feel really far away from thinking about public protest and police violence in particular. But in another way, to me at least, start to think about some of those ideas about also what is public and what is private, where bodies fit into these things, what is natural and what is constructed. And so field edgings here these are photographs that I've been making since about 2011. Almost all of them have happened in the Midwest. They're called field edgings, and thinking about boundaries ultimately in the landscape, and then how we might define and also change them, as well as making scale relationships yet again to thinking about things that might be on or adjacent to our body and how those might relate to the landscape. And so we just have a couple of these as well. And for context, the ones that I just showed were all shot in Iowa in 2019, all at the Viking Lake State Park, which is a constructed lake that's part of the Iowa Natural Resources Department parks. They had their 100th anniversary this past year. And so I was involved in a project that was thinking about artists going into the parks and looking at them. And so I also happened to be at Viking Lake as they were dropping the lake levels. And so it became really clear this actually very much controlled nature that was happening in the park as soon as they started dropping the level of the lake and revealing this sort of expanded edge. I don't know if there actually aren't so many images of that edge in particular here, but everything there is ultimately centered around this lake that is made with a dam that is pictured in a fair number of these images, and particularly this last one, that flat edge along the top is this constructed dam that made the lake.
What do you think? Should we break here?
Yeah, from here I've got images of the show. Shall I?
Let's we'll pin ourselves to the, or if Alice could pin us side by side. It can look like we're talking to each other. Can you pin us, Alice, side by side?
Looks like we either do everybody or, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we had to do.
Yeah.
I think we're just gonna have to
Do the speaker
do
view.
this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. I think there's some way that you just put like a little tack beside us. Like if you hit the 3 buttons to the side of each of our images, you hit pin.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And then it'll be Olivia and I. When everyone puts it on speaker view, it'll just be her and I.
We learned something today. Thank you, Shannon.
I'm on a lot.
I'm not sure that we can pin more than one person.
They can. The host should be
Yeah,
able
but
to.
you're both pinned, so
Yep.
we're seeing the 2 of you.
Mhm.
Okay.
Forget it.
Super. Thanks. So if everyone else meets themselves, then I should be able to see you again, Olivia.
I don't know. I may have unpinned myself.
Don't unpin yourself.
Elise.
No,
Sorry.
still pinned.
Yep.
Oh, okay. I don't
are.
see a pin, but that's it's me. Anyways, this is
We see
Well,
the pin.
Yeah.
Do we need to mute ourselves? Is that what you're telling me? Maybe?
yeah, or you're gonna keep
Okay.
popping from my view. Yeah. But all the hopefully you as the host should have done that for all the participants if they have it on speaker view. Weirdly now, Olivia, you've disappeared from my screen. Will you say something?
I'm speaking. Can you see me, Shannon?
There you are. Okay. It doesn't get easier to do this. So I think I wrote that essay for you without asking this like pretty obvious question, which is where do you think in your at what point in your life, or at what was the sort of the thing that kind of inspired or sort of stimulated this, what appears to me to be a really long-term investigation into the boundary, or into that kind of in between or liminal space? And you talk about all of that so beautifully in the images you showed, but I'm not actually sure I know what brought you to that as like a query that you in many ways are like always going at, you know, what all of the work sort of continues to sort of poke at this, like question, you know, what it means to be, what the edge is or what the in-between is.
That is a very good question, I think. But I think, well, first of all, I think I've always pursued my work. I guess I've always made the work that felt like it needed to get made, if that makes sense. Like and over years of making it, maybe that has actually just emerged as a thing. I think. I mean, I suppose I first started thinking about it as edges maybe when I was a graduate student. Certainly, in part just because of where lace exists.
So the lace maybe came first, and then you found yourself at the edge.
But I also, I mean, I think that the work that I was doing specifically in Turkey, where you're thinking about kind of, for me, it was very clear that Oya was something that a woman mostly, who was quiet or had to be quiet, could actually be communicating, right? So this, in many ways, it's about actually how, maybe myself, but also like how one exists in the world with other people and in space, and maybe not always quite knowing or understanding like where or how that is. So I think that that's part of it. Like I guess, you know, being out in the world is hard.
Yeah.
And it's something that, you know, I've realized recently was also in some ways not always a given for me. to actually really fully participate in the world. But I made a very clear decision to do that as I would say a 20 something, like a late teenager, 20 something. I said, no, I want to do things. But it's not without its struggles. And so I think that like those boundaries, right, where my body ends and the rest of the world begins is maybe, and that seems really obvious. Like I'm saying it now, I'm like, that feels really obvious, but it also feels like maybe that's like the beginning part at least. But then there are also places I have a lot of interests as a person in the world. And so I'm trying to figure out how we sort of identify ourselves and define all of these different areas, right? Shannon, I think that you're quite similar in that way too, right? You make things, you write things, you direct things, you bring other people together, but then you also, you know, have these individual practices. So I think that that's part of it also. Like, can I make a drawing? Can I make a textile that is a drawing? Can I make things with other people? Like, and the things that I make with other people, I think are very much about the spaces between us ultimately,
Right.
as practices.
Right.
So, and then that expands, and I'm hoping now and moving forward also that I can continue to think about that in a larger way, as opposed to something that's just coming from me and my own personal experience or things that I'm seeing in other people. I've always seen the ramifications into larger contexts, even if they aren't always super obvious in the work. To me, they always are there.
Mm-hmm. I think, I mean, asking that question and then hearing you say, well, maybe that's really obvious. I mean, it is one of those things that I think I find when really getting to know somebody's art and getting to know them is that sometimes the impetus for a practice is actually very simple. It's a very simple way that that person relates to the world, or particular need that they have in order to navigate being alive, you know. And then it becomes something that they can sort of they continuously study, and then it starts to touch on all of these other more perhaps universal, you know, kinds of themes. And so when you distilled it down to that very thing, I thought, right, yeah, the threshold as a space, I think is a really kind of compelling subject matter, because it is that space where and I talk about these things in the essay. It's sort of the place where the, you know, public and private sort of briefly overlap, or they whether it's the true threshold of a piece of architecture or the lace at the edge of a underskirt or something. It's that little overlapping space. And I think one of the things I find really really compelling about the way you work is that you study, or to some degree expose, like the variety of those thresholds, the very fine, very thin, you know, almost invisible, visibly scaled versions of the threshold, and then the kind of much larger, more public concept of the threshold. And that you know, perhaps the reason the reason most people connect with work is you find something very kind of personal in those things that other people are studying. But I think I'm a fairly introverted person, and when I tell people that who know me maybe professionally, they don't believe that. But I think one of the things I find really interesting about your work is that it, as somebody who spends a lot of mental energy on kind of navigating that threshold, it really feels familiar to me, like what it means to like transition in and out of, and how to do it and when to do it in and out of the private and the public. And I think for the first time, I thought when you just gave this introduction, like, oh yeah, the balcony is that, what a really interesting space between those things, because you're still inside your space, but you can go outside and you can put things on the balcony that are bright and colorful, or not, or you can decorate it or not. You can light it up. You can do all these things to the balcony that help you be in public in a way, if you yourself are not going to. They can help you feel more comfortable being in public while still being in your own space. Like it's kind of a fantastic thing, the balcony. I think the balcony might have been made for introverts. Like, I'm excited about balconies now. Anyways, very rambling way of saying that yeah, I think that sometimes when you distill down where work starts, it can sometimes seem very simple, and then it continually kind of unravels and touches into these more and more complex places that you couldn't possibly expect, like your experience in Turkey. I mean, that is not in any way something that you would have foreseen when you were working in the studio in grad school.
No, certainly not. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that unraveling sort of a practice over, and I'm 11 years postgraduate school now, and how did that happen? I'm not quite sure, but and I went to graduate school, a number of years already also into practicing on my own, and sort of I guess privately in that way, or outside of an academic context. But for me, always to be able to look back at the work that one makes and see how it also then is informing the future is really, I think, pretty incredible. It's nice actually today to show, I mean, you asked me to sort of start with the lace making and the drawing. We didn't actually look at the drawings, but we did look at and for me, they're not necessarily things to necessarily differentiate, but the way that you sort of start to understand yourself through these things is always interesting. And yeah, it's like you build this, I feel like I can see myself through the work that I've made. And now being what feels like 20 years into this, it's kind of incredible in many ways.
Right.
But,
well, I think writing about the show and really starting to think about like stitch all of those practices together, or like in some ways really think about how I initially knew you and understood the work through that lace making practice, as somebody who has spent a lot of time in sort of thinking about fiber and then thinking about then where it sort of ends up with what's on in the exhibition. I actually found that I sort of understood lace differently or anew through thinking through where that journey had taken your work. I don't think I had considered before that lace, or through thinking about the Oya work, I don't think I had ever truly thought about how that edge is something that negotiates the private, space of the body and the personal space of the body with the public space. Like, I'd not considered that as this kind of specific demarcation between those two, between those two spaces. And that, it's a lovely exercise to begin to see something like, maybe to some degree, at least in this country, like any kind of trim on something is thought of as being decorative and not having a lot of critical meaning. It's less about, it has less sort of poetic negotiation going on in it, at least in the kind of like cultural language that we put around ideas of decoration or trim or like embellishment or whatever. And I think that shifted for me when I started thinking about your work and really looking at those edges. I mean, it starts with thinking about the lace through the Oya, but then going beyond that and starting to really look around me at the types of trim, and that can get into architecture, like away from sort of what we conceive as decorative trim and into the more architectural, but looking around me and seeing trim really differently and much less like ornament and much more like something that is just like this negotiation of space, or like an indicator, like here's the edge, here's the threshold.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing actually is specific to lace making, and it's interesting to sort of be dwelling on lace making quite so much. It's not, I mean, it certainly is still a part of what I do, and I have a big project that I'm hoping to finish this summer, but it does inform so much of what I've done. Is it actually, as much as I think about it as an edge, a lot of the work that I do with it and the sort of patterns that I work with it are actually considered grounds, right? They're considered the spaces like a fill almost, as opposed to actually demarcating an edge. It's actually a way to fill up space, or things that might lie underneath ultimately.
And that's something that you have, that terminology ground is something that you've integrated into a great deal of your other work, including the collaboration that you have. That language of grounds, which I don't think is very, I mean, I think it's okay to tease that out because I don't think that's really like terminology that people are very familiar with.
Yeah, this is really true. And I've been thinking a lot more about ground and what that means. Both like coming from the lace making, but also thinking about like weaving also as a ground, or the way that a woven textile is often the ground for something else, for instance, the way we talk about painting grounds, or any number of things, as well as land and everything else. There is certainly, I actually feel like in many ways, a lot of my work has started to go there, and there's so much more to think about as far as even just that term ground. Thinking about what that means and how that can be sort of excavated within my work.
How would you define that, and would you define it differently than the word foundation?
Oh, interesting. Foundation, I feel like, goes deep. Ground is maybe more about surface ultimately, or like it's actually that space, like that same edge, but thinking in a different direction, right? The edge of a surface ultimately, maybe. That's one possibility for it. Like thinking about a painting ground, or the way that I was thinking about plaster and having to put plaster and put things down in order to be able to support things. Ground is a support. Foundation, I suppose, is also a support. It feels like spatially it takes up a different space. I don't know. I feel like that's a really exciting thing to think about ultimately, the difference between foundation and ground.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I like what you said, that the foundation's deeper. Maybe we think about foundations as things that are hopefully built to last, you know, that there's something that other things are constructed and reconstructed on. But what the way you've talked about it, I'm thinking maybe ground is more preparatory. Is that possible? Even if it's permanent, that it's almost it's like the preparatory phase.
Yeah. Huh. I'm not sure. I'm actually, because I feel like I want to respond to that with like actually the words laying a foundation.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, there we go. We're in that loop.
Yeah. Well, but no, but that's what's wonderful about language is that, you know, I think when we take things into art, we're abstracting, you know, terms and concepts that we might be more familiar with linguistically or in other fields, and we're doing other things with them. So it's kind of it's a fun loop. Like, all right, so it's not that, it's slightly more this. And in that same wordplay, I think I started to think about the you know, all of your pieces that incorporate walking, and what that relationship might be then if you're thinking about ground, not just literally as in like the ground beneath your feet, but as that kind of same almost infrathin preparatory surface, what's like happening in the walk, or in you know, in kind of traveling along that ground on that surface.
I'm sorry. So what's actually happening in that walk? Is that
I mean, I don't know if it's a question. It's more just like in hearing these, you know, in talking through the connection, or the sort of like, I don't know, the pregnancy of the word ground maybe in your work. I then think about like walking, and that walking is a significant part of a number of your pieces. So then, you know, how is that act of walking in relationship to like a ground, not like the ground, like the earth, but like this same sort of idea, like can that surface have the same resonance for you as like the thin coating of plaster, or the weaving that is the structure that's the ground for something else?
Oh, yeah, I mean, certainly. And it's been, I feel like one of the maybe the bigger aha moments for me on that front, that it's an aha moment, but that has lasted for 6 years now, maybe, it was even like when I started taking those photographs of looking at the ground while walking, and I took them for a year before I had the moment where my shadow started to become part of it. And my shadow then became this spill of water, right? Where it was actually sort of making a ground, right? It was making a space that it was also able to hold the space in a way that my body couldn't. But the shadow kind of then became a mark and became this extended time and place of that walk, which then I was able to translate into. I'd been starting the watercolor drawings around the same time, and so slowly making those associations, I feel like they're coming finally maybe a little bit together in the way that I'm thinking about the sort of plaster and drawing work together. Was certainly sort of out of this maybe defining of a ground through the absence of light, right? With the shadow, like the shadow of my own body in the sunshine, which happened for the first time in one of those walks, maybe it would have been 2016. And so I've been sort of slowly drawing that out since then.
Do you want to show some of those images, since we just touched on that and in the show a little bit, right?
I think there are a number of people here who maybe, or there are at least a few people here who have not seen the show at all. And so we will maybe go through, I will just pick up where we left off, and I will page through these just to give a sense of the exhibition. I won't dwell on these too long for the moment, but in the exhibition there were two galleries that were engaged, two different architects, two different spaces, two really different spatial orientations, one very vertical, the other very horizontal. And so this was the first project that was called Mediate, Equivocate, which was looking at this 40-foot high wall as a two-sided object more so than a surface. So here maybe more than just a ground, right? Or something that is not just a ground, but one that has two faces. And I think, let me maybe jump ahead to just an image of those walks, which is here. And so here you can see a number of the sort of photographic images. So I started taking these in 2015. And they've happened in a lot of different places, both internationally and then also very locally. The image that I think about when I talk about that sort of aha moment is the one here. I think everyone can see my cursor. This happened at the ancient city of Claros in the Aegean coast of Turkey. And it was probably about noon. So the sun is quite high there. So the sun and my body created this, what felt like a spill of water on the ground there. And so I took that image, I got excited about that. I think it took me until maybe, the last year or so to actually be able to sort of process that and think about that in relationship to other things. But in the exhibition, in the IMP wing, I installed what I call body of work is called The Shadow is My Body. And so it's a series of plaster objects that have been made essentially to be grounds for drawing. The objects themselves I had thought about ultimately as sort of spatial drawing supports. And then showing them for the first time with on these tabletops that I made that are coming directly from some of those photographs.
So just to clarify that, there we go. Okay. So the ink spills that we're seeing right now when we look down at this table are pulled from some of those original photographs.
Yeah, let me see. Yeah, I feel like actually, well, this one's quite clear in its relationship, maybe. Go back to the photographs. The one that's right in the center here.
Yeah.
That's the one that one's pulled from. And then this one is also, this is that image from Claros.
Mhm.
It became, here you can see the photograph.
So are you seeing the the photographic part of this work now? Is that falling back into a step in the process, or did each of those things still feel like cohesive individual art objects to you? Like, does this photograph still feel like a discrete artwork that you want to kind of maintain that part of the practice, or does it completely fall back into process now?
Shannon, that's a really good question. I think there was this moment where I was showing the photographs directly next to the objects. In some ways, it did really feel transitional.
Yeah.
I think getting that photographic information back up to the scale of my own body has felt really important.
Yeah.
I don't know if the watercolor translation is necessary, like maybe essential. I'm not sure that that part's essential, but I do think that actually having it be at size makes a lot more sense to me ultimately.
Yeah. Let's go back to that great overview image of the piece. It's so interesting, just given that we're looking at work now that's about movement in space, but how much your work keeps moving down like a connected trajectory that makes a lot of sense, but it has a real kind of movement and pace to it as you you really feel, I think, in the work how something that's happened in a previous body of work is like picked up and brought into the next thing, and then picked up and brought into the next thing. And it's like I can see in the photographs from Turkey how that then ends up being in the photograph of you walking on the ridges, then ends up with you taking the photos of your feet, that ends up in then of course in this work. But there's a really kind of lovely sense of constant movement throughout the practice that that I just find really compelling, like as a maybe like just the demonstration of how an artist continually is processing and reprocessing a set of ideas or interests, but it's like carrying them along a certain kind of journey.
I really appreciate that you see and feel that. For me, the things never feel separate, I suppose. I mean, there are things that are different from others, but yeah, for me, it has always felt like a single sort of line of inquiry, though it changes form all the time, it changes material all the time. It never really feels all that different or separate from each other, even though I guess maybe I have, in 10 years, I've gone from making lace to making sculptures. I don't even like, and there are always photographs, but like whether the photographs are present or not is sort of an ongoing and evolving process as well. Certainly, I like the photographic lens also has always felt like a consistent thing for me, even if it's hardly ever that I show images now in that way.
But you do say point of view a lot when you talk about your own work, and you certainly did in the introduction. And I think that right there is, like clearly that like strong connection to your relationship to photography. You really, maybe you're navigating the world always with that kind of lens in mind, even if it's absent for the rest of us. When we're not seeing it, you are showing us something. I mean, as I'm talking out loud, I'm thinking about, oh yeah, I'm talking about this in the essay too, like the idea that you're showing us something, like, oh, well, of course, yeah, because that's where you come from. That's sort of your training. So you really have that like deeply in your person as a maker, is this kind of concept of point of view and showing people that.
Yeah, and Shannon, I think that was actually one of the things, another thing that was really important for me in the essay was thinking about, like, I think you even said at one point, look here, right? I feel like I do that. I hadn't known that I do that in my work exactly, but I certainly have always done it with a camera. I do it in my teaching also, is like how to pay attention, but also sort of point and direction. Hopefully one that's not too maybe heavy-handed ultimately. But
no, I think not. I think that that's what it's generous. I think it's generous far more than it would ever be heavy-handed. I mean, with this work, I find I love and as much as it's now, kind of been extracted from those photographs, still, I think with this placement, looking down on it, and I'm sorry, I don't get to see this in person, or didn't get to see this in person, or that you chose a space where it was possible to really look down on these from a distance, but they're still tabletop height. So when somebody's in the gallery, they can see it kind of at this other, like they can see it at that height, or they can get really high up and look down on it. And I like that kind of expansion contraction there, so that at that height distance, it maybe is more relates more to the body, the way you came about making this work to begin with, like through walking, through looking down at our feet. But then when it's at the tabletop height, that's where I think it's generous, because you open up the space for people to see it in a different way, because they're looking at it, much more from sort of the scale of like personal architecture. So they're seeing the shadow cast, or the relationship to body and object, maybe more in the way they see things, and kind of like in their built environment and around them. But getting up there and looking down at the gallery, then you can have that sort of more looking down at the ground perspective. So I hope that was just a great experiment for you in dealing with, like, working with that kind of architectural space, where just the nature of it allowed that point of view, or that look here nature of your work to be able to expand and contract, like get the far and near with something like, of course, anyone who hangs a painting on the wall can get that if people step away from it, but this is a little different, because truly being able to look down into a space at work is I think a unique vantage point to be able to set up for a practice, and to kind of really think through or experiment with concepts in the work, knowing that you have that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this was the first time, hopefully not the last, that I get to be able to work in that way. I think certainly, like, the conception of it and then the actual physical realities of it were sort of also two different things ultimately. I think one thing that maybe I hadn't fully accounted for in the space over there was actually how thick the ledge was. So it became sort of an interesting, I felt like I was always kind of throwing myself over the edge of the architecture to kind of be able to look at it from that point of view. Also, though, nicely, there was this stairway that gave a really high vantage point, and you also got to be able to sort of sink down into it. Shannon, I appreciate that, like the sort of bringing up as an act of generosity. In many ways, those sculptures were all about kind of being able to lift the drawing up to the viewer a little bit. And not being in a totally sort of horizontal or like on the ground situation, but having this sort of gentle like lift or bringing towards the viewer, so that it's not like quite the strain. It's like a little bit more gentle.
Yeah, levitating. Not a question I've asked you before, but when I am asking, just having now seen these images, I mean, I haven't, full disclosure, I haven't seen these images of the installation until really recently. I'm really interested in the subtlety of just the color choices. The color of the board, the plaster board that the ink drawings are on, is really close to the color of the concrete in the space. And so it's a pretty, I mean, this is an exercise in subtlety in I think a pretty demanding space. I do love this space in the museum. I mean, I think the architecture of many museums is really demanding, even when you wouldn't expect it to be. But I think the space is fantastic, but I think it's tricky. So yeah, I'm just curious about that. Like, just some of these more maybe formal or aesthetic decisions that you might have made when coming to this installation.
Well, specifically in the space, oh yeah, I mean, it was a, I feel like this, because this show sort of unfolded over about 2.5 years ultimately. And it started from this gallery space, was like really where when the Art Center first approached me about doing the show, um, I sort of said without hesitation that I wanted to work in this space, in part because of its horizontality, in part because of the overhead point of view. And so the rest of it kind of unfurled from that, being able to work in the other wing. It wasn't primary for me. I was ultimately interested also in the bank of windows that are here. It's a little bit, let me see if I've got, I actually don't have another image of the space of that precisely here. But so thinking about that light that's coming in from the windows, which I believe they are south facing, there's sort of this direct light source, or not indirect light source, but a directionality to the light all day long. And so as I was starting to think about putting these objects, because I'd completed these objects right around the time I started thinking about the show. And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out, like, they should be on bigger pedestals than the first time. I showed them these objects once before I showed them in this show, and they were on sort of a really tight tabletop, and I knew they needed more space. But I ultimately was thinking about those windows as a light source, and those windows as a light source for the shadow, for the walks that I had taken.
Mm-hmm.
And so and they're here in my studio now because they just came back, but I made probably a total of 8 different photographs that I translated into these tabletop surfaces. And so the color, I mean, the coloration, I think that was intuitive in part. The surfaces, they're wood surfaces, and I stained them because they definitely needed to be lighter and a different color. So it's several coats of white stain. The orientation of them, though, I think is also really important. And I think, Shannon, you're probably also asking about that, which is ultimately that the shadows, I oriented the tables to have the light source essentially be the same orientation of the light source to my body and the images that I was making. And so each of the walks are sort of oriented in that way. And so each of the tables are oriented in that way. So in the one that you see closely here, for instance, the sun is sort of coming down at my side, and you're seeing the sort of side shadow. In this one, my body the sun is maybe like slightly towards my back, but not directly behind me. And so the orientation of the table is also coming from that point of view. And then in the two on the other side of the gallery, they're both sort of either from directly behind or sort of up high above.
Can I have a couple more questions about this work before we talk about the other significant piece, but the fragments that you then extract and are laid out on the table, those extractions are directly from the same photograph that the spill is taken from, or are those more or less pulled together as kind of marks that you can are interchangeable or movable between these installations?
So those are the objects happened actually really separately from the photographs. They happened slowly, maybe over 2 or 3 years in my studio. Most of them were really intuitive. A lot of them for me, because a lot of my work is just very experimentally oriented, like what happens if I do this, and they're rarely outcome driven. It's mostly about process and trying to figure out ways through that. And so a lot of the objects, and there are piles of them, like it's also, one of the anthropology faculty came a couple of weeks ago to walk through the show with me, and it was really exciting to talk with somebody who has a really different experience of plaster. Yeah, we talked a lot about like, oh, well, these are just kind of the bits that, you know, some of them are bits that fell off, some of them are really intentionally made, some of them I've made grounds and poured over them. As of right now, and I kind of stopped making them in 2019, actually. I've wanted to go back to them, but it just hasn't happened yet for any number of reasons. And so a lot of them were intuitive. Some of them are made with 3D printed ceramic forms as their molds, where like there's actually components of that you know, aren't made by me at all. They're made by collaborators who can make programs for me and that we can manipulate together. For example, some of them happen really fast in the studio.
I think it's really interesting that how they act like punctuation in a way in the drawings, you know, that they, in relationship, I mean, to the sort of watercolor drawings, that they almost, they feel like from the outside, at least to me, that they sort of come in and then they punctuate this other sentence, you know, or it's like, okay, we need a comma here, you know, and they become this, or a marker, you know, but they do something, they make a kind of punctuation or notation onto the watercolor walk that, again, this is how I sort of read it when I see them, but I like the sense that they are, while I imagine that these are like, that this is now the arrangement, I like the sense though that it could change, that there is a malleability to this. I'm the person with the cat that's talking in the video, in the talk. I like the feeling that they might be malleable, that this punctuation might be changeable, even if this is the permanent relationship.
Yeah, I think that they are, for me, they ultimately are malleable and changeable. I did this installation. I'm not sure that I will or will not do it again. That sort of hasn't been determined. Yeah, this work, for whatever reason, does feel very, and maybe it's also because actually the surfaces come from my studio. Like some of them are my work surfaces. Some of them may return to being my work surfaces. Some of them are work surfaces that have like been inserted underneath. So these are sort of almost stacks of drawings.
Yeah. And that's such oh, sorry.
So Ingrid Lilligren is here, and she called them notebooks when she first saw them.
Oh yeah, yeah. They're I mean, I think that going back to this idea of what like a ground is, I think, and also just this sort of sense that your practice is this unfolding, unraveling walk, you know, that we're going on with you, that there is something great about how these sort of plaster footnotes or punctuations or what have you, just, I don't know, just how that they're like fragments of the ground, I guess. I'm kind of just in this conversation with you right now, thinking of sort of some other things about the work that I guess I'm seeing now through this idea of what a ground can be, and that you've kind of, I don't know, kind of broken it up and provided, yeah, these real kind of, you know, if the ground is sort of this surface that something else is built upon, you're sort of providing to us these little moments, I guess, of possibility in punctuating this work with these fragments. They're very much possibility, you know, to me, as opposed to like leftovers. It's like, well, it could be this, it could be this. We could go here. We could go here.
Yes, no, I quite like that reading of them. Actually, for me, especially, I tend to be just generally really indecisive about a lot of things. And one thing that's really been very helpful with making these in particular is that they are very decisive. Like they're decisive in the way that they get made, right? Plaster is a rather decisive medium in that way. Like it's not malleable. You pour it and then it's done. And so they've been good in that way. But I like that they also read as sort of changeable things.
Do you want to answer these questions first, or should we go to, should we just look at the rest of the exhibition before we do so?
No, what do we think? We can talk about Catherine has a couple of questions about writing, or
Yeah. She wonders if, she wonders about the process for developing the essay, and the process is maybe not that, wasn't that complex, I guess. I already knew Olivia, Catherine, so I think that was already 50% of the process. Maybe it was some familiarity, pre-existing familiarity, but we talked at great length about the show and what Olivia's plans were, and then we met up over Zoom one day. Olivia was gracious enough to sort of show me in the space what she was planning for the installation, because it was so specific to the architecture. And then I went away and alone to my thoughts and produced something and sent it back to Olivia for her approval. I think that's probably the honest truth, isn't it?
yeah, that's it.
I mean, I had all of the images at my disposal the whole time, though. So, I mean, I think for me, I was referencing, I mean, I was just continually looking at the work and kind of, you know, processing what I was seeing in that and what I was familiar with Olivia's practice over the years, over the last 11 years. It's not a very sexy answer, but.
Shannon, if I could just interject, this is Susan at Olson-Larsen. I just want to say I really enjoyed the essay very much. And I think that it stands on its own as a beautiful piece of writing, even without seeing the show. You know, I was lucky enough to see the show and read the essay, and it just, it opened up new layers of Olivia's very layered work for me, and I'm sure for others, but I just wanted to put that in there. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I think the second part of, I mean, this is not a conversation about my work, but I will just say to that point that I think as somebody who writes about art a lot, I with the permission of people I'm writing for, like to try to be to meet somebody as a writer, to meet the person's art as a writer, and not maybe just be there to sort of explain things in a more traditional art historical way. I don't sort of see my work in that light. So it is wonderful when artists feel, I guess, comfortable enough with kind of letting me respond. So she also wondered, though, Olivia, if you had any other writings or references that are going to inform future work or changed your perspective on this current body work.
Oh boy. Oh. I feel like I'm drawing a big blank here on that question right now. I don't think it's like, it's certainly not without answer. Well, I mean, I feel like I already talked briefly, at least, about the stanzas of that Emily Dickinson poem, which I was reading. I was actually reading an Anne Carson book that pointed towards that poem in particular, which was ultimately about Eros. And so I think very much then also thinking about oneself and outside of oneself and how that relationship happens. They're specifically thinking about maybe romantic love, but also, I mean, I think that there are sort of broader implications there. And then I think, I feel like I'm looking at my bookshelf because I can't quite see the titles on there, but there are a couple that, so Bluets by Maggie Nelson also was something that I was looking at closely, and a lot of the titles actually of the fragments are taken directly from the Maggie Nelson poem. I feel like I also actually have to sort of cite Paula Matheson, my sound collaborator, on that sort of that practice of thinking about poetry as a way of titling. Also, it's something that she is heavily committed to, and so has sort of, I would say, leaked into the way that I think at and look at my work sometimes. And I guess in that way, so writing becomes maybe more fundamental. I'm looking forward to hopefully spending some more time reading this summer. I feel like I'm a little disconnected from that at the moment, and so I'm looking forward to being more present with new texts.
I feel that way too. I actually had a very difficult time reading over the last year, which is not usually reading is maybe my only real hobby. And then I just felt like I couldn't really get further than a few pages into a book. There were a couple moments where it burst through and I could finish a couple things, but then it would go away again. So I don't know. The last year has had different kinds of impact on different people, but that was definitely one for me where it was very difficult to focus on a full text. Before, I know we're talking quite a little bit over probably the expectation for an hour, but I think it would be great to just finish off the show before we say goodbye. And maybe one of the questions I want to ask while we look at the rest of the exhibition is similar to, like, are there any other texts or references that are influencing the trajectory or the progression of the work? I'm really interested in how maybe the other art in the museum as a kind of text might have made an impression or on you in your practice, particularly because of the way the entirety of the show is installed in a museum that has a few pieces of art that are very permanently in their locations, and certainly stitching through the walls of an exhibition space means that you're both interrupting a conversation between other artworks and also participating in it. So yeah, are any of those artworks texts that have, or is this architecture a text that is maybe motivated some new thoughts or new thinking on your practice going forward?
Oh boy, the practice going forward part, that feels like a big question mark right now.
Well, then leave that off.
Sort of be in a place where I feel like I'm almost able to take a breath right now, while also getting sort of really engaged in a bunch of projects this summer. So to go through the second half of the show, which for me, especially because there was sort of a really set wayfinding situation for the museum until maybe the last 2 weeks of my show, everybody was routed in a really specific way. This was actually what I might call the first part, because it was always the first part that you saw. It was certainly, when I would bring people to see the show, it was the first thing that we would go look at together. So this installation is over in the wing of the museum, designed by Richard Meyer. I'd been working on the show for ended up being a total of 2.5 years, but shortly after starting my thinking about this show, I'd certainly been interested in this horizontal space in the Pei galleries, but it was brought to my sort of attention pretty quickly, and Alison Ferris had been the curatorial director at the Art Center when we first started working on the show. I eventually ended up working closely with Jared Ledesma on it, but this vertical atrium space, which is a 40-foot wall, she had sort of brought it up and said, well, obviously your work needs to go there. And it took me a while to come around to it, but as I thought about it, I started to become quite interested in working in this space as well. And so I cycled through a number of different ways of thinking about that, ultimately coming to this proposal drawing that you see here, I think in sort of the late fall this last year. So thinking about running these ropes or stitches through the gallery space. Here, it really impacts all 3 floors of the galleries in this wing of the museum. And so here in the proposal, you can see the top gallery, the middle galleries, and then the atrium space, all of which contain the work. And so these are some sketches thinking about essentially a section view and all of the different possibilities for the way that a thread might be able to sort of slide, slither, get stitched through all of these spaces. And actually these drawings are some of my favorite parts of this project in particular. And so ultimately the installation is here. You can see this is the atrium space. There are a total of about seven stitches that are in these channels in the wall. Each one of them is on both sides, both in the atrium space and then the adjoining gallery. They do, yeah, so it's a stitch that visually at least runs all the way through the wall. I was certainly interested in thinking about the fronts and the backs of things. Shannon, I think you really also then nicely related that to the way that we sometimes think about textiles. For me, the stitches, and I have some images a little bit later, came actually out of some weaving that I've been developing on my loom as part of my sound collaboration that I've had ongoing for 5 years. So here, I guess thinking about the wall also not actually just as a ground or as a surface, but also as something that is an object and that has multiple surfaces. It is a material that we can dig into in that way, and that doesn't simply sort of hang in the background, or is also not necessarily a place of neutrality, I think would be the extension of that. And so here we are on the ground floor, and I have these slides sort of roughly set up as a walkthrough through the space. And so there are, Shannon, I think it is actually a really important thing to think about all of the different artworks that are present with the installation here. In this view, you see a Tony Craig sculpture that is a 1,000+ pound piece of iron. It's a shell form with these instruments coming out of it. Most of the works, while I mostly decided to interact with them, I did not place them. They were existing in the museum and I responded to them. So it is ultimately a responsive installation in many, many ways, responding both to the architecture and then also the artworks that are hanging. And so here, as we come around in the bottom floor galleries, this was the one space that I hadn't completely permeated with the installation, but I had sort of leaked around the edges. And so there are 2 drawings installed in the corner here, which I'll show a little bit more of those. And then also just to note that there are some Ana Mendieta images that they are in juxtaposition with. You can see that more closely here, which again, not something that I had planned, but certainly something that made a lot of sense to me, putting these images actually of my own body in direct conversation with her, the absences of also her body. So these are some of the two of the 4 drawings that were in the exhibition. These are watercolor drawings. All of them were developed during 2020, basically after the start of the pandemic. So these 2 both are working with photographic information. In this one, a direct inkjet print that I'm then working into, also using these woven grounds and patterns as an overlay. And then here, a watercolor translation from some of those panoramic photographs of the ground while walking, again with this overshot patterning that I have been developing in the studio, and how they sort of intersect and play off of each other, and ultimately also sort of interact with the boundaries and the edges of some of these spaces. If I take a couple steps back, I also just have a couple of images from earlier drawings that I started making. Some of the first time I started looking at horizontal surfaces or the ground, like actually the floor, while I was living in Rome in 2015. And then those intersecting with these sort of random spills and thinking about patterning. And so if we come back to the installation, this is probably one of my favorite points of view, where you can see that essentially this running stitch that goes up the edge of the wall. this 40-foot wall, and it's probably, it's a reasonable view of sort of the whole, not the whole of it, but particularly that edge space. And then here, if we talk about framing or point of view, I was actually, as much as I had been thinking about the corners and these drawings existing there, it ultimately was still a surprise to me how many different ways you could see the drawings through the architecture. The Art Center had never shown work in those spaces before, and my hope is that they will start using those spaces now, because I think we were all surprised at actually how visible these were, even if they weren't in spaces that were sort of traditional to be looking at or showing artwork in. And so here, in many ways, the sort of painting that I had to, but also wanted to intersect with the most, which is here it's Range by Bryce Marden. You can also see one of the John Chamberlain sculpture off to the right. And then across from this is a Frank Stella painting that for me ultimately was actually maybe a little bit more of the inspiration and response to the way that I was thinking about stitching into this wall. But the Bryce Marden painting has been here, ultimately can't really be moved. It wasn't present when we were working on the installation, but it did have to come back right away. And so these three panels and sort of relating, intersecting, framing, and then also making sure that the wall ultimately didn't fade into the background. For me, a lot of people have giggled at this installation, both in humor. I do think it's ultimately a humorous installation, right? Thinking about stitching these big stitches through the wall. It also, though, made a lot of people like ever so slightly uncomfortable, which for me was, I think, a bit of a success on that front. But to hear for me, thinking about the Bryce Marden, and as somebody who teaches color theory sometimes, I feel like the painting ultimately started turning into color chips in a way that I was pretty happy with. It also, for me, the installation drew attention to the edges of the Marden painting that I, as somebody who spends a lot of time looking at edges, hadn't really been alerted to before until the painting got put back in place. And then moving up to the top floor here, again, you can see a drawing through some of these spaces in the architecture, looking down on the floor. Here, just a little tiny frame of these stitches through the wall, and then the top floor galleries. And actually a number of, both of these paintings ultimately also became, they had been there, they continue to be there, but really, I think just even on a formal level responded really nicely to the work. And yeah, so here in particular, I was then responding very directly with the rope to the way, the drawing language that's visible in that painting in particular. And I don't, oh man, I'm gonna goof up all the names, and I, for whatever reason, don't have them written down in front of me. I usually do. So I'm not gonna go rattling off all the names at this moment, but then here are the drawings that were both in the corners on the upper floor. This was actually the drawing that had been in my studio when the pandemic started, and I worked on it from March through May of 2020 in particular. Here, the title also being Overshot, which is that fabric, again, that I've been weaving. And then here, the first time I'd actually brought some of that photographic information. So in this, you can see just the top of my foot, the edge of my shoe, intersecting and inverting these woven patterns, having almost the front and the back of the way I think about these in some ways is having the front and the back of the overshot happening simultaneously within one drawing, and using the shadow as the place where that sort of flip or change happens. And so here, just also a little bit of visual reference to this project Between Systems and Grounds that I have with Paula Matheson, but ultimately the graphical information from the weaving that's developing and how that relates to the drawings in particular. So that's some of that installation. I do know it's 3:30, so we've certainly gone on a long time now.
Yeah, we'll leave it to other folks to ask you any further questions. I guess it felt important to have that moment to recognize that you were not an artist who was being curated into a museum space where a curator was then making other decisions, like, let's put Olivia's installation with these artworks. And that's actually really interesting. I mean, it's very rare, I think, that an artist gets to come in and say, I'm going to explore this architecture and the collection that is permanently on the wall with this like pretty significant gesture, right? That even though it's very subtle and elegant in many ways, it's also like pretty big. It's wild. It's like both at once. It's quiet and loud. But I think just to put that fine point on it, that a curator didn't then make selections to pair with your work. And I think that that's pretty exciting that you were negotiating, your work was negotiating something with those artworks, and in many ways makes complete sense for your practice, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I Shannon, I'm glad that because I also found that part to be sort of important. And there were some conversations throughout the process, but most of the works were very much intact. There were a few of them were written into my contract, like very explicitly, actually, and also about exactly how I could and could not. There were then also maybe some spaces for both communication and miscommunication, and all of that. But it was a very rich experience ultimately in that way, and that there were a lot of things. It's also a space I know quite well. It's a 10-minute drive from my house. I walk there occasionally, and it's somewhere I've been in Iowa 5 years now, and it's somewhere I've spent a lot of time. And so to be able to do an installation like that at that scale, and it's both quiet and loud, Shannon, that understanding of it to me rings very true. It's not something that I feel I get, well, I certainly don't get the chance to do it very often. It felt once in a lifetime in many ways, to be able to think about something that I know that well, and to be able to approach that thoroughly, also with the amount of support that I was able to have, because the installation itself was a big ruckus. I mean, you've done museum work. There were multiple lifts. There were lots of people. There was just a lot. It was a lot.
Well, congratulations. I think it's pretty phenomenal. So I'm glad that you got to do
while
that.
While you guys were talking about that, a word that kept coming to mind for me was piercing, which I think can often have kind of a negative or violent connotation, but you were like literally piercing into the walls, but also piercing through expectations and norms and all of these things coming together. And it's interesting how language, like you were talking about before, kind of plays into that and kind of weaves in, as it were. So yeah, just a thought. So I think we can kind of wrap up. Does that sound okay?
So.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for all of your time. This was fascinating, and enlightening, and yes, we appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us to do it. It was great to see Olivia and everybody who joined us today.
Susan, Elise, thank you so much for making this possible. I really do appreciate it. And Shannon, it's nice to actually be able to, this feels very full circle to be able to come back and talk about the work with you after it's been done and complete, through also the lens of your writing. So.
Well, thanks for inviting me to do it. I enjoyed it so much. I'm so sad I didn't actually get the in-person. There'll be another wall, I hope.
I can't think about it right now.
Well, have a wonderful Sunday, everyone.
Yep, you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.